If you've been playing Call of Duty Warzone since they've changed the playlists, which we will talk about in a future video, because getting rid of like duos and trios is kind of insane if you think about it. Whether you're on Resurgence or on Big Map, the experience is the same. What you are playing right now is the sweatiest version of Call of Duty Warzone imaginable. This is happening because when you unify all of your player base under just a handful of playlists, you're basically getting the best out of skill-based matchmaking from a development perspective. More players means a more efficient algorithm, it means better matchmaking, and it ultimately means that the sweatiest version of Warzone that you're playing exists in this very moment. But the sweatiest version of Warzone very much exists in the World Series of Warzone and what we now know to be as competitive Warzone. And one of the biggest misconceptions I see about competitive Warzone online is that it's just the same game. The Warzone at a competitive level is really not that much different from Warzone at a public level, and the comment sections back this up. You would be surprised how many times I've mentioned the World Series of Warzone or competitive Warzone, and people are asking really brain dead questions like, hey, why is this guy who gets 30 kills at home only managing 6? Well, the answer's pretty clear. He's playing against some of the best players in the world who are also capable of getting that in a public lobby. If you have ever ran into a top tier level content creator or a World Series pro, the speed at which you die and the amount that they are capable of reaching the theoretical TTK of a weapon and getting the absolute most out of it is criminally insane. So today I wanted to talk about why a 120 player lobby at the World Series Warzone and competitive Warzone in particular play so radically different. And if you've ever been curious as to what it's like to play against some of the best competitors in the Warzone scene, and why it's radically different, this video is going to paint that picture for you. As somebody who's not only competed at the global finals of World Series last year, but also somebody who's paid close attention to how it's developed over the past year or so, there is so much to unpack about how public Warzone and comp Warzone are massively different. And in many ways, battle royales are in their own formula in terms of how competitive versions of their game and public versions of their game are radically different. If you go and play Valorant Comp versus Valorant Unrated, or Rainbow Six Comp versus Rainbow Six Unrated, or CS, most of those experiences are fundamentally the same. There are some bans that come into the competitive versions, different map pools, maybe some different weapon pools, but at a fundamental level, the game plays quite similarly, and what's expected of you at every single rank is quite painstakingly clear. There is sort of a natural progression from what a silver player looks like to what a radiant player looks like, for example, in Valorant. And you can very clearly see differences in the intensity and intellect of people's gameplay that determine the rank that they sit at. But battle royales are an entirely different beast, and unrated versions of games like PUBG, Apex, and Warzone play so dramatically different to their competitive counterparts, which is arguably one of the biggest flaws about how these games operate in the comp space. So I wanted to break down to you guys the things that make World Series of Warzone competitive gameplay different to public lobby gameplay. The first and foremost, and most obviously, being the caliber of skill in the lobby and the fact that everybody who is there is capable of churning out high tier games at home. Now, pubs lobbies, in all honesty, are just pubs lobbies. They tend to be quite easy, and for the most part, a competitive Warzone player with a group of other comp players should never really struggle winning a game of public lobbies in Warzone. But when it comes to comp lobbies, you're talking about entirely different acquisitions of players. You're talking about players who are averaging around 4 to 7 KDs versus the average KD of a Warzone player, which is 0.8. We are talking about two entirely different worlds. And the first major difference in a competitive version of Warzone is the first phase of the game. Now, in public lobbies, the first phase of a lobby tends to be quite scrappy, and whilst you are ultimately building towards the goal of reaching a loadout drop, in Comp Warzone, not getting your loadout in the first phase of the game is without a doubt the largest death sentence in the game, and it pins to the most overarching difficulty point of Comp Warzone, which is regainability. At a competitive level, regaining in Warzone is extremely challenging. Money, flares, things that get you back into the title tend to be more restrictive, and getting to those locations like buy stations uninterrupted without being challenged or pushed out by opponents is also very challenging. So it's absolutely essential at the very earliest portions of the game that you get your loadout drop on board at fairly uncontested level. Losing somebody to the gulag or having a 3 grand buyback early on is very challenging because it means that you're forced into a position where you're a man down and you also potentially have to move to a location to achieve a buyback. So moving at a disadvantage without your loadout is basically a death sentence in Comp Warzone. And getting a loadout uncontested is super, super key. It's one of the reasons the team who ended up winning the tournament was so successful, is because absolutely everybody refused to challenge them at pop-off power. From my own analysis when preparing from the previous year's World Series of Warzone, teams that contested drops early in the game and ended up fighting other teams early on before getting their loadouts on board ended up statistically losing out on top placements by as much as 60 to 70%. So there's a very different dynamic in competitive Warzone where you want almost uncontested drops every single time. And in fact, in competitive PUBG, again, a very different battle royale, but battle royale nonetheless, it's actually considered fair play when some teams deliberately tell other opponents where they're going to be dropping and will drop uncontested, almost respecting each other's space boundaries and drop-off points. Now, granted, in PUBG, ground loot is ground loot, and that is the entire basis of the game, and loadout drops aren't important, but it just gives you an indication of just how much of a problem something like the initial phase of your game going wrong can be for something like Warzone. The second thing you're noticing is probably something you guys are actually seeing in your more competitive games of Warzone as the SBMM has been cranked, and that is what I call advantage min-maxing. Now, in sweatier lobbies of Warzone, something I definitely recognize is I see far more players using 4 or 5 different kill streaks, multiple grenades and thermites, multiple semtexes. And in Comp Warzone, that's exactly what you're going to see. You are going to be seeing teams stockpiling 3 or 4 streaks to use, 6 or 7 different grenades to use in every single push. Because so much as a 10 to 20% advantage in a gunfight, because you happen to hit a grenade or you happen to hit, a semtex or you happen to hit some kind of lethal, is worth its weight in gold. It's the difference between you winning and losing a gunfight, and advantage min-maxing is a huge component of the current competitive version of Warzone. And in a very good way, this is going to be disappearing in the future of competitive Warzone as the backpack system disappears. Inventories have undoubtedly made Warzone comp much messier and definitely much less dynamic. It means that teams have 10 or 12 different grenades, 4 or 5 different kill streaks, and it just makes it an absolute nightmare to get a clean gunfight off. Most fights tend to be decided by utilities as opposed to be decided by actual weapons themselves. Entry picks on a squad in Warzone, especially in a competitive scenario, are worth the entire weight of a gunfight. If you manage to go into a situation where it's a 3v3 and suddenly it's a 3v2, you can almost statistically guarantee that you're going to win that fight the majority of the time. It would take a colossal play or a colossal outplay from a squad who is a man down to win a gunfight. And when points and placement are that important, and generally speaking, like I mentioned before, staying alive so that you don't have to undergo the process of regaining, you really do see this huge, huge part of a meta shift where grenades, lethals, inventory management becomes such an important component of what's currently competitive Warzone, but thankfully, hopefully won't be a huge component going forward. And I really think having less inventory management is going to make it something that's a bit more competitive. The fourth big thing you'll see is something you don't really see at all at a public level of Warzone, and that's gas plays. The gas game in competitive Warzone to win your matches is absolutely huge. We're talking about teams who are bringing 3 or 4 PDS systems, gold gas masks, and making sure that they can stay in the gas for as much as up to 2 minutes if necessary. This is an entire different zone and different world from what we've seen in uncompetitive versions of Warzone and public lobbies. When there is no emphasis on placement multipliers and no emphasis on kill multipliers, generally speaking, public games are just about who manages to finish first. But in Comp Warzone, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th place are equally as important, and the idea that you can sit in the gas for 2 or 3 minutes is just as incentivized. And it's something you're going to see a lot of going forward in the future of Comp Warzone, is more creative ways to utilize the gas in order to survive. We used to have the floating meta back in the day of Warzone Ranked, where people would buy somebody back and they'd sit in the sky for as long as humanly possible. Now we have the in-gas meta. The final largest component, and this is something that you'll notice radically different from Comp Warzone to Pub Warzone, is how teams operate. In public Warzone, the idea of stacking is somewhat frowned upon, generally by people who are generally quite sweaty, and we know for a fact that working together in a coordinated 3-stack is a way of guaranteeing success in gunfights and guaranteeing that you're going to make it through the next stage of the game. And it's no different in Comp to some extent. But the difference with comp is that the ability to make advanced and complex plays and pinches as one unified group is much more important. Three stacking in regular Warzone is literally just a case of running into a group as a 3-stack and hoping for the best. In Comp Warzone is having a dedicated in-game leader, tell somebody to do X, somebody to do Y, and somebody to do Z, so that you're always sufficiently playing out kill trades and always sufficiently making sure that one person wins a gunfight as opposed to another. Pinches on stairwells, pinches on positions, utilizing kill streaks and bunker busters all come into the equation in any given gunfight. And we're talking about, the difference between winning or losing a general gunfight with another team being the amount of communication that's achieved in a 30-second window. It's a radically different world that feels as though things are happening in slow motion, even though they're happening just as fast as any given Warzone game. So those are the 5 big differences you'll notice about Comp Warzone. I personally hope we see competitive Warzone develop into a better place in the future, and I do feel as though it needs more work. Private matches need more work, the meta in-game and the banning systems need more work, and I've already given you guys a whole video on how I felt World Series of Warzone wasn't quite a shift in the right direction. So feel free to check out that video if you so wish. As always folks, thank you for watching, drop a like, and I'll see you in the next one.